The rain fell in heavy sheets across the highway as cars sped by, their headlights cutting through the gray afternoon. On the shoulder of Interstate 75, a small blue sedan sat abandoned by the rushing traffic, its hazard lights blinking desperately against the downpour. Behind the wheel, a woman in her mid-50s clutched her steering wheel, her knuckles white with worry. Lisa had been on her way to visit her daughter in the hospital when her front tire blew out with a frightening bang. For 20 minutes, she had sat there watching cars zoom past, not one stopping to help. She wasn't sure what to do. Changing a tire wasn't something she'd ever had to learn. Her husband had always handled such things, but he had passed away 3 years ago. Her phone battery was almost dead, and the roadside assistance she'd called said it would be at least an hour before someone could reach her. Meanwhile, a few miles back, a truck driver named Robert was making his usual cross-country haul. He'd been on the road for nearly 15 years now, delivering goods from coast to coast. The job was lonely sometimes, but it paid the bills and kept food on the table for his 2 teenage boys back home. As his wipers fought against the rain, he noticed the blue sedan up ahead, its hazards blinking through the mist. Robert had seen too many people stranded on highways over the years. Most truckers these days just kept driving, tight schedules, company policies, and the general wariness people had about strangers meant fewer stopped to help. But Robert couldn't just drive by. His mother had raised him better than that. He slowed his 18-wheeler and carefully pulled onto the shoulder, leaving enough distance between his truck and the sedan. Grabbing his raincoat and a flashlight, he stepped out into the downpour. Lisa jumped when she heard the knock on her window. Looking up, she saw a tall man in a yellow raincoat, water streaming down his face despite the hood pulled over his head. "Having some trouble?" Robert's voice was gentle but loud enough to be heard over the rain and passing traffic. Lisa hesitated before rolling down her window slightly. "My tire blew out. I called for help, but they won't be here for at least an hour." Robert nodded understandingly. "That's a long time to wait in this weather. I've changed plenty of tires in my day. Would you like some help?" Lisa studied his face. There was kindness in his eyes, the sort of honest concern that reminded her of her late husband. Still, she was cautious. "Are you sure? It's pouring out there." "I'm already soaked," Robert laughed, gesturing to his dripping clothes. "Besides, my mama would have my hide if she knew I drove past someone who needed help, especially in weather like this." After a moment's hesitation, Lisa popped the trunk. "Thank you. I really appreciate this." Robert went to work quickly, retrieving the spare tire and jack from the trunk. Despite the rain making everything slippery and the roar of passing vehicles sending waves of water over him, his movements were practiced and efficient. Years on the road had taught him to be prepared for situations just like this one. As he worked, Lisa watched through her rear-view mirror. There was something comforting about the way he moved, confident but not hurried, careful with her car as if it were his own. She felt a pang of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. 15 minutes later, Robert knocked on her window again, completely drenched but smiling. "All set. The spare's on nice and tight. It'll get you where you need to go, but you should get a proper replacement soon." "I can't thank you enough," Lisa said, reaching for her purse. "Please, let me give you something for your trouble." Robert waved his hand dismissively. "No need for that. Just helping out a fellow traveler. At least let me get your name and address so I can send you a proper thank you." "Robert," he said simply. "And honestly, knowing you can get where you need to go safely is thanks enough." As Lisa insisted on at least shaking his hand, Robert glanced at her dashboard and froze. Among a few scattered items was a silver-framed photograph of a young man in military dress uniform. The photo was positioned where Lisa could see it while driving, clearly a treasured item. "That's my son," Lisa said, noticing Robert's gaze. "He's serving overseas right now. Third tour." Robert couldn't speak. His throat had closed up, and he felt his eyes burning with sudden tears. The young man in the photo was unmistakable, the same person who had saved Robert's youngest son's life during a flash flood 2 years ago. The young soldier had been home on leave and heavy rains caused a local river to overflow, sweeping Robert's son away in the current. Without hesitation, the soldier had jumped in, pulling the boy to safety. Robert had never forgotten that face, had kept a newspaper clipping of the local hero who disappeared back to duty before Robert could properly thank him. He had tried to track him down but had only learned his first name and that he had redeployed shortly after the incident. "Is your son's name David?" Robert asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lisa looked surprised. "Yes, how did you know that?" Robert wiped the rain, or perhaps tears, from his face. "Ma'am, your son saved my boy's life 2 years ago. Pulled him out of Miller's Creek during the flood when no one else would go in after him." Lisa's hand flew to her mouth. "The teenager? The one who got caught in the current? That was your son?" Robert nodded, unable to speak as emotion overwhelmed him. All this time, he had wanted to thank the young man who had risked his life without hesitation, to tell him what his courage had meant to a father who had almost lost everything. And now, through some twist of fate, he had happened upon the hero's mother stranded on the side of the road. The coincidence seemed too perfect, too orchestrated to be mere chance. Perhaps his mother was right about angels watching over good people, Robert thought. "I've been trying to find your son to thank him properly for years," Robert finally managed to say. "I never thought I'd get the chance." Lisa reached out and squeezed his hand. "And now you've helped me when I needed it most." Her eyes welled with tears. "David would say that makes us even, but I think this is something more." The rain continued to fall around them, but neither noticed any more. In the chaotic randomness of life, they had found a moment of perfect symmetry, a circle completed in the most unexpected way. The rain gradually subsided as Robert and Lisa sat in her car, sharing stories about their families. Robert pulled out his wallet, carefully removing a folded newspaper clipping that had worn thin at the creases from years of handling. "This is the only thing I have of that day," he said, handing Lisa the yellowed paper. They didn't use David's full name in the article since he didn't want attention. Lisa smoothed out the clipping with gentle fingers. The headline read, "Off-Duty Soldier Rescues Teen from Flood Waters," with a blurry photo showing 2 figures on a muddy riverbank. She traced the outline of her son's face in the grainy image. "That sounds just like him," she smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Never wants credit for anything. He's been that way since he was little." Robert nodded. "My boy Thomas still talks about him. Says he wasn't scared because the man who saved him was so calm. Kept telling Thomas to look at his eyes, not at the water." Lisa felt a surge of pride warm her chest. David was always good in a crisis. Even as a child, he'd be the one comforting others when things went wrong. The coincidence of their meeting was still sinking in for both of them. Robert described how he'd tried to find David after the rescue, going to the local army recruitment office and even posting on social media, but David had shipped out just 2 days after the incident. "I promised myself if I ever found him, I'd thank him properly," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never thought I'd get the chance through helping someone change a tire." Lisa explained that she had been on her way to see her daughter, who had just given birth to her first child, David's first niece. David couldn't get leave to come home for the birth, which had hit the family hard. "He's missing so many important moments," she sighed. "I was bringing photos to send to him overseas." Robert checked his watch. His delivery schedule was tight, but some things were more important than making good time. "Where's the hospital?" he asked. "St. Mary's. About 30 miles ahead," Lisa replied. "I'm heading that way. Why don't I follow you there, make sure the spare holds up?" Lisa's grateful smile was all the answer he needed. As they drove toward the hospital, Robert called his dispatch to explain he'd be slightly delayed. The spare tire seemed to be holding up fine, but he kept a careful distance behind Lisa's sedan, watching for any signs of trouble. Meanwhile, Lisa's mind was racing. The universe had a strange way of connecting people, she thought. Ever since losing her husband, she'd felt adrift, handling life's challenges alone. But today's event felt like a sign that good deeds created invisible bonds between people, connections that sometimes revealed themselves in the most unexpected ways. At the hospital, Robert found himself being introduced to Lisa's daughter, Rebecca, and her newborn baby girl. The tiny infant was sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms, unaware of the remarkable coincidence that had brought this stranger to her bedside. "So you're telling me," Rebecca said, looking between her mother and Robert, "that this man's son is the one David pulled from the creek? And you just happened to get a flat tire on his route?" "Life works in mysterious ways," Lisa nodded, gently stroking her granddaughter's cheek. As they talked, Robert learned more about David. He was stationed in a particularly dangerous area, commanding a small unit responsible for helping local citizens rebuild infrastructure. His letters home were always positive, focusing on schools being rebuilt and medical supplies being delivered, but Lisa worried constantly. "He doesn't tell us everything," Lisa admitted. "He doesn't want us to worry, but I know it's harder than he lets on." Robert sat quietly for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card with a trucking company logo on it. He scribbled something on the back. "My cell number," he explained, handing it to Lisa. "I'd like to stay in touch, if that's okay. And when David comes home next, I'd really like to meet him properly. My family would too." Lisa accepted the card, promising to connect them when David returned. "He's due for leave in about 3 months, if everything goes according to plan. I know he'd want to meet Thomas." As Robert prepared to leave, needing to get back on the road to make up for lost time, Lisa stopped him with a gentle hand on his arm. "You know," she said softly, "I was having one of the worst days before you stopped. My daughter going into labor early, the tire blowing out, nobody stopping to help. I started to lose faith in people. And then you showed up, not just to help me, but as living proof that my son's good deed mattered." Robert nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "That's how I felt after your son saved Thomas. Like maybe the world wasn't as cold as it sometimes seems." Before he left, Rebecca asked if she could take a photo of Robert with Lisa to send to David. "He'll never believe this story otherwise," she explained with a smile. Standing next to Lisa in the hospital hallway, Robert felt a strange sense of completion. For 2 years, he'd carried the weight of an unpaid debt, not just the debt of his son's life being saved, but the deeper obligation to acknowledge that act of courage. Today, he'd taken the first step toward fulfilling that obligation. As a truck driver, Robert had seen countless sunrises across America, witnessed the changing seasons along endless highways, and observed humanity in all its forms at rest stops and diners across the country. But he had never experienced anything like the connection he discovered today, a reminder that in a world where people often passed each other without a second glance, moments of genuine human connection could still emerge from the chaos. Driving away from the hospital, Robert called his son Thomas. "You'll never believe who I met today," he began, smiling as he merged back onto the highway, the weight of an 18-wheeler behind him and a lightness in his heart that hadn't been there before. In the coming weeks, as Lisa sent photos of the new baby to David overseas, she included the picture of herself and Robert, along with a letter explaining the remarkable encounter. Across the globe, in a dusty tent far from home, a soldier would soon open that letter and discover that some stories don't end when you think they do, sometimes they're just beginning. 3 weeks passed before Lisa's letter reached David. The military mail system worked on its own mysterious timeline, especially to remote outposts. When the packet of mail finally arrived, David was just returning from a 36-hour mission, exhausted and covered in dust that seemed to have worked its way into every fold of his uniform. He sat on his cot in the corner of the shared tent, savoring the brief moment of privacy as his unit members were busy elsewhere. The familiar handwriting on the envelope brought an immediate smile to his face. His mother's letters were a lifeline connecting him to a world that sometimes felt like a distant dream. David opened the envelope carefully, first pulling out the photos of his new niece. His tired face softened as he examined the tiny features, trying to decide if she looked more like his sister or her husband. There were several shots of the baby from different angles, Rebecca looking tired but radiant, and then a photo that made him pause. His mother stood in a hospital hallway next to a tall man David didn't recognize. They were both smiling, but something about their expressions suggested there was more to the story than just a random picture. He flipped to his mother's letter, curiosity piqued. As David read the first few paragraphs, his eyebrows rose in surprise. The story of the flat tire and the helpful truck driver seemed ordinary enough until he reached the part about the photograph on the dashboard. His hands stilled. The teenager he'd pulled from the creek 2 years ago. He remembered that day vividly. David had been jogging along the riverbank when he heard screams. The spring rains had swelled the usually calm creek into a churning mass of brown water. Without thinking, he'd plunged in, fighting the current to reach the terrified boy being swept downstream. The rescue itself had been a blur of adrenaline and instinct, his training kicking in automatically. Afterward, he'd made sure the boy was safe with the paramedics before quietly leaving the scene. His leave was nearly over, and he hadn't wanted any fuss. Plus, he'd never been comfortable with praise. Doing the right thing wasn't something that needed recognition. Now, reading his mother's detailed account of meeting the boy's father, David felt a strange mixture of emotions. He'd never expected to hear anything more about that incident. In his mind, it had been a closed chapter, a moment when being in the right place at the right time had made a difference. He hadn't realized the family had been trying to find him all this time. "You okay, Captain?" a voice interrupted his thoughts. David looked up to see his second-in-command, Lee, standing at the tent entrance. "Yeah," David nodded, folding the letter. "Just news from home." "Good news. Must be something special," Lee commented. "First smile I've seen on your face in weeks." David tucked the letter under his pillow. Sometimes the world gets smaller in ways you don't expect. Later that night, as the base settled into the relative quiet of evening routines, David reread his mother's letter. She had included Robert's phone number and email address, with a note saying he'd welcome hearing directly from David if possible. Communications from their location were limited and monitored, but they were allowed occasional personal calls and emails. David rarely used his allotment, preferring to let his team members connect with their families instead. But this felt important somehow. The next day, David used his communication privileges to send a brief email to Robert. He kept it simple, thanking him for helping his mother and expressing surprise at the connection. He wasn't sure when he'd get a response, or if Robert would even write back. The reply came faster than expected. Within 2 days, David opened his email to find a long message from Robert. The truck driver wrote about his son Thomas, how the now 16-year-old had struggled with nightmares after the flood but had gained a new confidence knowing someone had risked their life to save him. Robert described how Thomas had joined the junior lifeguards program, determined to learn rescue skills himself. "You didn't just save his life that day," Robert wrote. "You changed its direction." David read the email 3 times, each reading revealing details he'd missed before. There was something profoundly moving about learning the ripple effects of an action he'd taken without a second thought. It was strange to think that while he'd been deployed, facing daily challenges and dangers, his brief moment of courage back home had continued to influence people's lives. In the following weeks, David and Robert exchanged several messages. David learned that Robert's delivery route often took him near the military base where David's family lived, and he had already visited Lisa twice since their chance meeting. The second time, he'd brought Thomas along. "Your mom showed us your childhood photos," Robert wrote. Thomas couldn't believe the guy who saved him used to have such bad haircuts. David laughed out loud at that, earning curious glances from his teammates. It was odd but comforting to picture his mother sharing stories with Robert and Thomas, these strangers who somehow weren't strangers anymore. As David's deployment entered its final month, the correspondence became more frequent. Robert mentioned that Thomas wanted to meet him when he returned home, if David was comfortable with it. His mother wrote that Robert's family had become regular visitors, bringing groceries when she was too busy caring for her new granddaughter to shop. "It's like we've known them for years," Lisa wrote. "I think your father would have approved." The mention of his father gave David pause. It had been over 3 years since his dad's passing, but the absence still felt raw sometimes. His father had been the one to teach him about responsibility, about stopping to help others in need. The values that had sent David into the military were the same ones that had made him dive into that flooded creek without hesitation. As his unit prepared for their return home, David found himself looking forward not just to seeing his family, but to meeting Robert and Thomas as well. The connection that had formed in his absence felt like a gift, unexpected but valuable. On his last night at the outpost, as he packed his few personal belongings, David came across the photo his mother had sent. He studied the image of his mother and Robert standing in that hospital hallway, both smiling with the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be faked. His commanding officer had often told them that the true measure of their service wasn't in the missions completed or the objectives achieved, but in the lives touched along the way. David had always thought that referred to their work overseas, but now he understood it could mean something much closer to home as well. The airport buzzed with activity as families waited anxiously for their loved ones to arrive. Lisa stood near the front of the crowd, checking her watch every few minutes. Beside her, Robert shifted his weight from one foot to the other, equally nervous but for different reasons. "Are you sure he's okay with us being here?" Robert asked for the third time. "I don't want to intrude on your family reunion." Lisa patted his arm reassuringly. "David specifically asked if you'd come. Trust me, he wants to meet you." Behind them, Thomas stood quietly, his teenage awkwardness amplified by the significance of the moment. At 16, he was tall and lanky, with traces of the man he would become showing in his features. He'd spent hours the night before trying to decide what to wear, what to say, how to act around the man who had saved his life. "What if he doesn't remember me?" Thomas whispered to his father. Robert squeezed his son's shoulder. "He remembers. And even if the details are fuzzy, what matters is that you're here now." The announcement that the military transport flight had landed sent a ripple of excitement through the waiting crowd. Parents clutched welcome signs, children bounced impatiently, and partners straightened their clothes nervously. When the first uniformed personnel began emerging through the arrival doors, a cheer went up from the assembled families. Lisa stood on her tiptoes, scanning each face that appeared. And then, suddenly, there he was. David looked leaner than when he'd left, his face more weathered, but his smile was the same as he spotted his mother in the crowd. He made his way toward her, navigating through the emotional reunions happening all around him. Lisa wrapped her arms around her son, holding him tightly as if to reassure herself that he was really there, safe and whole. When they finally separated, both wiping away tears, she turned slightly to include Robert and Thomas in the moment. "David, this is Robert and his son Thomas." David's eyes met Robert's, and a look of recognition and understanding passed between them. Without hesitation, David extended his hand. "Sir, it's an honor to meet you properly." Robert ignored the outstretched hand and pulled David into a bear hug instead. "The honor is all mine, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "All mine." When Robert released him, David turned to Thomas. The teenager stood frozen, suddenly overwhelmed by coming face to face with the person he'd thought about almost daily for 2 years. "Hey Thomas," David said casually, as if they were old friends meeting again after a long absence. "You've grown about a foot since I last saw you." Thomas nodded, struggling to find his voice. "I joined junior lifeguards," he finally blurted out. "Because of what you did." David's face lit up. "That's fantastic. Saving lives is a pretty good career path." The initial awkwardness faded as they collected David's bags and made their way to the parking lot. Lisa had arranged for them all to have dinner together at her house, where Rebecca would be waiting with the baby. On the drive home, David sat in the back seat with Thomas, the two of them talking about swimming techniques and water safety as if they'd known each other for years. Lisa glanced in the rearview mirror, marveling at how natural it all seemed. In the passenger seat, Robert caught her eye and smiled, clearly thinking the same thing. At the house, Rebecca greeted her brother with a tearful hug before proudly placing her daughter in his arms. David stared down at his niece in wonder, gently touching her tiny fingers. "She looks like you did as a baby," Lisa told him. Same serious expression. As they gathered around the dining table, the conversation flowed easily between stories from David's childhood, updates about his service, the parts he could share, and Thomas's experiences with the junior lifeguards. If anyone had looked in from outside, they might have mistaken them for a family that had been together for years. After dinner, as Rebecca put the baby down for the night and Lisa cleaned up in the kitchen, Robert stepped outside onto the back porch where David was enjoying a moment of quiet. The night air was cool, filled with the familiar sense of home that David had missed during his deployment. "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for 2 years," Robert said, leaning against the railing. "And now that you're here, words don't seem adequate." David shook his head. "You don't need to say anything, sir." Robert, the older man, corrected. "And yes, I do. What you did that day, jumping into that water without knowing if you'd make it back out, that kind of courage deserves acknowledgement." David looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Robert said firmly. "They wouldn't. I was there, remember? Dozens of people stood on that bank watching, calling 911, filming with their phones. But only you went in." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of that day hanging between them. "Why did you leave so quickly afterward?" Robert finally asked. "The paramedics said you disappeared before anyone could get your full name." David looked out into the darkness of the backyard. "I had to report back to base the next day. And honestly, I didn't do it for recognition." He hesitated, then added, "My dad always said that how you act when no one's watching, when there's nothing to gain, that's who you really are." Robert nodded slowly. "Your mom told me about your father. Sounds like he was a wise man." "The best," David agreed, a note of sadness in his voice. "I still catch myself wanting to tell him things, show him places I've been." "He would be incredibly proud of the man you've become," Robert said quietly. Inside the house, Thomas and Lisa watched the two men talking through the window. Thomas had been nervous about meeting David, worried the reality couldn't possibly live up to the heroic figure he'd built up in his mind over the past 2 years. But the man who'd arrived at the airport wasn't some untouchable hero, he was genuine and kind, listening to Thomas's stories with real interest. "He's not what I expected," Thomas admitted to Lisa. She smiled knowingly. "What did you expect?" Thomas shrugged. "I don't know. Someone bigger, maybe? More, superhero-like?" "That's the thing about real heroes," Lisa said, watching her son through the window. "They never think what they did was extraordinary. They just did what needed doing." As the evening wound down and Robert prepared to drive himself and Thomas home, promises were made for future get-togethers. David would be home on leave for 30 days before his next assignment, plenty of time for Thomas to make good on his offer to show David the new rescue techniques he'd learned. Standing in the driveway, watching Robert's truck disappear down the street, Lisa linked her arm through her son's. "Life has a funny way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" she mused. David nodded, thinking about the strange path that had led from a flooded creek to a flat tire to this moment. "I'm starting to believe there are no random acts of kindness," he said. "Just links in a chain we can't always see." The next few weeks passed quickly as David settled back into civilian rhythms. After years of rigid military schedules, there was something deliciously freeing about deciding his own days. He spent mornings helping his sister with the baby, afternoons catching up with old friends, and evenings sitting on the porch with his mother, talking about everything and nothing. Thomas called 3 days after their first meeting, asking hesitantly if David would like to come watch his junior lifeguard training session. David agreed immediately, curious to see the teenager in his element. The community pool was busy that Saturday morning, with about 15 teenagers in red swimsuits practicing rescue techniques under the watchful eye of an instructor. David sat in the bleachers, watching as Thomas demonstrated a proper approach to a drowning victim. "He's one of our best," said a voice beside him. David turned to see a middle-aged woman in a polo shirt with "Head Coach" embroidered on the chest. "You family?" David hesitated, unsure how to explain the connection. "Friend of the family," he settled on. The coach nodded approvingly. "That kid has something special. Most of them join because their parents make them or it looks good on college applications. Thomas joined because he genuinely wants to save lives." "I heard he had a close call himself," David said. The coach's expression grew serious. "Nearly drowned in Miller's Creek flood 2 years back. When he first joined us, he was still having nightmares about it. Could barely put his face in the water." David watched Thomas execute a perfect rescue hold on a teammate. "Looks like he's conquered that fear." "More than conquered it," the coach agreed. "He's turned it into purpose. That's rare at any age, but especially for a teenager." After training, Thomas spotted David and jogged over, his hair still wet from the pool. His face was flushed with a mixture of exertion and pride. "You came," he said, sounding slightly surprised. "Wouldn't have missed it," David replied. "Your coach was just telling me you're one of her best students." Thomas's face reddened further. "She exaggerates." "I don't think so," David said seriously. "What I saw out there was impressive." They walked to a nearby diner for lunch, Thomas eagerly explaining the certification process and the volunteer hours he'd be doing at the local lake once he passed his final tests. His earlier shyness had disappeared, replaced by authentic enthusiasm. "Dad says I can't officially lifeguard until I'm 18, but I can assist the real lifeguards this summer if I keep my grades up," Thomas explained between bites of his burger. "That's a solid plan," David nodded. "The training you're getting now will give you a head start." Thomas set down his food, his expression turning serious. "Can I ask you something? About that day at the creek?" David took a sip of his soda, preparing himself. "Sure. Were you scared? When you jumped in?" The question caught David off guard. He'd been asked about the rescue before, usually with people focusing on the heroic aspect. No one had asked about his fear. "Terrified," he admitted. "That water was moving fast, and I knew the risks. But being scared doesn't mean you can't act." "That's what Dad always says," Thomas nodded. "That courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs doing anyway." "Your dad's a wise man," David smiled. Thomas studied his plate for a moment. "He cried, you know. When Mom was in the hospital last year for surgery. I'd never seen him cry before. He thought I was asleep, but I heard him in the kitchen in the middle of the night." David felt a tightness in his chest at the vulnerability in Thomas's voice. "That's because he loves her. The people we love the most are the ones who can scare us the most." "Is that why you joined the army? Because you weren't scared?" David laughed softly. "No, I was definitely scared my first day of basic training. Terrified, actually. But sometimes the things that scare us are exactly what we need to do." As they finished lunch, Thomas asked tentatively if David would be willing to come to his final certification test the following weekend. For good luck, he added quickly. I'd be honored, David replied, meaning it. Later that evening, David received a text message from Robert thanking him for spending time with Thomas. He hasn't stopped talking about lunch. Whatever you said really made an impression. David typed back, he's a great kid. You've done an amazing job as his father. The response came quickly, coming from you, that means a lot. That night, as David lay in his childhood bed staring at the familiar cracks in the ceiling, he thought about the unexpected turns his life had taken. The split-second decision to jump into that creek had set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. And Robert's decision to stop and help a stranger with a flat tire had closed a circle neither of them knew existed. The next day, David drove to the cemetery where his father was buried. He hadn't had a chance to visit since returning home, and it felt important somehow, especially after everything that had happened. He placed fresh flowers on the grave and sat on the small bench nearby. You'd like Robert, he said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish talking to a headstone. He reminds me of you in some ways. Same solid decency. The cemetery was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and distant traffic. David told his father about his deployment, about meeting Robert and Thomas, about the strange connection that had formed between their families. I keep thinking about what you always said, that we never know how our actions will affect others. I guess you were right. As David was leaving the cemetery, his phone rang. It was Lisa, her voice tight with worry. Robert's been in an accident, she said without preamble. His truck went off the road during a delivery. He's in surgery at County General. How bad? David asked, already changing direction toward the hospital. They don't know yet. Thomas called me from the waiting room. He sounds scared to death. I'm on my way, David promised. The hospital waiting room was crowded when David arrived. He spotted Thomas immediately, hunched in a corner chair, his face pale and drawn. The teenager looked up as David approached, relief flooding his features. They said it might be hours before we know anything, Thomas said, his voice shaking slightly. Mom's talking to the doctors now. David sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder. Then we'll wait together. Lisa arrived 20 minutes later with coffee and sandwiches no one felt like eating. The three of them sat in a row of uncomfortable plastic chairs, time stretching out in that peculiar way it does in hospitals, minutes feeling like hours. He was delivering to Rockport, Thomas explained quietly. The dispatcher said another driver reported seeing his truck veer off the highway. They think he might have fallen asleep at the wheel. Your dad's tough, David reassured him. And he's got a lot to live for. Thomas nodded, but his eyes remained fixed on the double doors leading to the surgical area. He changed his route, you know. After meeting your mom. Requested more local deliveries so he could be home more often. Lisa reached over to squeeze Thomas's hand. He told me he was trying to make up for lost time. What do you mean? David asked. Thomas kept his eyes on the doors. After the creek thing, when I was having nightmares and stuff, Dad took some long-haul jobs. We needed the money for my therapy, but I think he also felt. I don't know, helpless. He couldn't fix what happened to me. David understood that feeling all too well, the desperate need to take action when someone you love is suffering. Sometimes the only thing worse than pain was watching someone else endure it while standing by, unable to help. The surgical doors swung open, and a tired-looking doctor in scrubs emerged. Family of Robert Walker? Thomas jumped to his feet, his mother right beside him. David stood a half-step behind, close enough to offer support but giving the family space. I'm Dr. Patel, the surgeon said, her face revealing nothing. Robert came through the surgery. We've managed to stop the internal bleeding and stabilize his condition. The collective relief was almost palpable. Thomas's shoulders sagged, and his mother put an arm around him. However, Dr. Patel continued, her tone cautious, he suffered significant trauma. There's a spinal injury we're concerned about, and he hasn't regained consciousness yet. The next 24 to 48 hours will be critical. But he's going to be okay, right? Thomas asked, his voice small. The doctor's expression softened. We're doing everything we can. Your father is strong, and that's in his favor. After the doctor left, promising updates when they had more information, Thomas slumped back into his chair. His mother sat beside him, talking quietly with the calm efficiency of someone who'd handled crises before. David heard fragments about insurance, work notifications, and arrangements for Thomas's younger sister who was staying with a neighbor. David, Lisa touched his arm. Would you mind sitting with Thomas while I make some calls? The reception's better outside. Of course, David nodded. When Lisa had gone, David sat next to Thomas, who was staring at the industrial tile floor. This is stupid, Thomas said suddenly. What is? Dad's the one who helps people. He stops for strangers with flat tires. He delivers supplies during snowstorms. He's not supposed to be the one who needs help. David recognized the anger in Thomas's voice, the unfairness of seeing someone strong become vulnerable. My dad died 3 years ago, David said quietly. Heart attack. He was the strongest person I knew. Fixed everything, solved every problem. Then suddenly, he was gone, and there was nothing anyone could do to fix it. Thomas looked up. I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'm not telling you that to scare you, David clarified quickly. Your dad's situation is different. He's got excellent doctors and a fighting chance. I'm telling you because I understand what it feels like when the person you thought was invincible turns out to be human after all. Thomas nodded slowly. When I was little, I thought my dad could lift anything, beat anyone. Then one day I saw him crying over a stupid movie, and it freaked me out. Let me guess, it was a dog movie, David smiled. Old Yeller, Thomas confirmed with the ghost of a smile. Total mess. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the background noise of the hospital flowing around them. Can I ask you something weird? Thomas said eventually. Sure. Do you believe in fate? Like, things happening for a reason? David considered the question carefully. I don't know about fate exactly. But I do think that our actions create ripples that go further than we can see. Sometimes those ripples come back to us in unexpected ways. Like you saving me, and then my dad helping your mom? Exactly like that, David nodded. So maybe there's a reason for this too? Thomas gestured vaguely toward the surgical ward. Some bigger picture we can't see yet? David wished he had a comforting answer, some wisdom that would make sense of this sudden tragedy. But platitudes felt hollow in the face of real fear. I don't know, he admitted. But I do know your dad didn't stop to help my mom because he expected anything in return. He did it because that's who he is. And that kind of goodness doesn't just disappear, even when bad things happen. When Lisa returned, she brought news that Robert's co-workers were organizing to cover his routes and that his health insurance would cover most of the medical expenses. Small reliefs in the midst of uncertainty. The hours crawled by. Rebecca arrived with food that went mostly uneaten. David stepped out occasionally to stretch his legs or call his unit buddies for brief updates, but he always returned to the waiting room. The unspoken agreement that they would wait together had become somehow important. At midnight, the nurse allowed Thomas and his mother to visit Robert briefly in the ICU. David waited, watching the minute hand on the wall clock make its slow circuit. When they returned, Thomas looked shaken. He looked so small, he whispered. With all the machines and tubes. David had seen that look before, on the faces of soldiers confronting the fragility of life for the first time. There were no words that could erase that realization, only presence to soften its impact. As the night deepened, the waiting room emptied of all but the most determined families. Lisa convinced Thomas to lie across several chairs and try to sleep, covering him with her jacket. She and David spoke in hushed tones about practical matters, what Thomas might need for school the next day, whether Rebecca could pick up Thomas's sister in the morning. "You don't have to stay," Lisa told David around 2 a.m. "We'll be fine." "I know you will," he said. "But I'd like to stay anyway, if that's okay." Lisa studied his face, then nodded. Robert would do the same. Exactly. Morning arrived with watery sunlight and fresh hospital shifts. The night nurse stopped by before leaving, informing them that Robert's vital signs had remained stable overnight, a cautiously positive sign. Thomas woke disoriented, the events of the previous day crashing back as he took in his surroundings. David handed him a cup of vending machine hot chocolate. "Any news?" Thomas asked, voice scratchy from sleep. "Stable through the night," David told him. "That's good." Thomas nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm cup. "What happens now?" It was a question that contained multitudes, about the day ahead, about his father's recovery, about their lives if things didn't go as hoped. "Now we take it one step at a time," David said. "That's all any of us can do." At 9:15 a.m., Dr. Patel returned, this time with a cautious smile. "Robert regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. He's groggy and in pain, but his responses are good. He's asking for his family." The transformation in Thomas was immediate, like seeing a light switch flipped. His entire body seemed to loosen, relief washing away the tension of uncertainty. As Thomas and his mother prepared to go in, the doctor added, "He mentioned someone named David. Said it was important." Thomas turned to David, eyebrows raised in question. "Go ahead," David urged them. "I'll be here when you're done." But Thomas shook his head. "You should come too. You're the reason we met in the first place." Lisa nodded in agreement. "Robert would want you there." The ICU was a landscape of beeping monitors and hushed voices. Robert lay in a bed surrounded by equipment, his normally robust frame diminished by injury and surgery. His eyes were closed when they entered, but they fluttered open at the sound of their approach. "There's my family," he whispered, voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been removed earlier. His gaze moved from his wife to his son, then settled on David. A weak smile appeared. "And the hero joins us again." "Not the hero this time," David said quietly. "Just the backup." Robert's hand moved slightly on the blanket, and Thomas took it carefully, mindful of the 4-line. "The doctor says you're going to be okay," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "But you really scared us, Dad." "Sorry about that," Robert managed. "Not my best driving." "Don't joke," his wife scolded gently, leaning down to kiss his forehead. "You need to rest." Robert's eyes were already drooping with exhaustion, but he seemed determined to say something more. He looked directly at David. "Told you, good deeds come back around." As Robert drifted back to sleep, David pondered those words. Standing there with this family that had become unexpectedly entwined with his own, he understood that Robert hadn't simply been referring to past events, but to this moment too, to David's presence now, completing a circle that had begun on the banks of a flooded creek 2 years ago. 3 months passed. Summer heat gave way to the first crisp days of autumn, trees along the highway beginning their transformation into gold and crimson. Robert's recovery had been slow but steady, first the critical days in the ICU, then the regular hospital room where a stream of fellow truck drivers and neighbors had visited with food and encouragement, and finally, 6 weeks after the accident, the homecoming. The doctors had been clear about the long road ahead. The spinal injury required intensive physical therapy, and Robert would need to use a wheelchair for several months, possibly longer. His trucking days were over, at least for the foreseeable future. On a bright Saturday morning, David pulled into the driveway of Robert's modest suburban home. The front yard had been transformed since his last visit. A newly constructed ramp replaced the front steps, and the garden beds had been rebuilt at a height accessible from a wheelchair. Thomas opened the door before David could knock. At 16 and a half, the boy seemed to grow taller each time David saw him. His summer as a junior lifeguard assistant had added muscle to his frame and confidence to his bearing. "He's out back," Thomas said by way of greeting. "Mom's at work, but she'll be home by lunch." David followed Thomas through the house, noticing the subtle changes made to accommodate Robert's wheelchair, furniture rearranged to create wider pathways, grab bars installed in strategic locations, a hospital bed set up in what had once been the dining room. In the backyard, Robert sat in his wheelchair beside a half-built wooden structure. Tools were scattered around him, and a sheaf of plans lay weighted down by a coffee mug on a nearby table. He looked up at the sound of the sliding door, his face breaking into a wide smile. Just in time, he called out. "I could use another pair of hands." David crossed the yard, taking in Robert's appearance. The man had lost weight during his hospital stay, but some of the healthy color had returned to his face. More importantly, the spark of determination in his eyes had never dimmed. "What are we building?" David asked, surveying the work in progress. "Wheelchair-accessible planter boxes," Robert explained. "Got tired of not being able to reach my tomatoes." Thomas rolled his eyes good-naturedly. "Dad's decided if he can't drive trucks anymore, he's going to become the neighborhood tomato king." "Gotta have a dream," Robert grinned, handing David a hammer. "Even if it's a small one." For the next hour, the three of them worked together on the planters, following Robert's instructions. The conversation flowed easily between them, a comfortable rhythm established through months of regular visits and shared meals. "Got my final medical evaluation next week," Robert mentioned as they secured the last panel. "Doc says don't get my hopes up about driving commercially again, but I might get cleared for regular vehicles eventually." "That's great news," David said sincerely. Robert's expression turned contemplative. "Your mom said you got your new assignment." David nodded. His leave had officially ended 2 months ago, but he'd been granted an extension to help with Robert's recovery, a rare accommodation made possible by letters from Robert's doctors and David's exemplary service record. "Fort Lewis, Washington. I report in 2 weeks." "Coast's a long way from here," Robert observed. "It is," David agreed. "But I requested a position with the training division. More predictable schedule, fewer deployments." What he didn't say, but what they all understood, was that the choice had been influenced by the connections he'd formed here. After years of moving wherever the army sent him, David had started thinking about putting down roots, about being able to return to the same place, and people, between assignments. Thomas disappeared inside to answer a phone call, leaving the two men alone in the yard. Robert adjusted his position in the wheelchair, wincing slightly at the movement. "Still hurts?" David asked. "Some days more than others," Robert admitted. "The wheelchair gets old fast, but I can't complain. I'm alive. Many aren't so lucky." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the distant sound of a lawnmower from a neighboring yard the only interruption. "You know," Robert said finally, "I've been thinking a lot about that day. Not the accident, the other day." "The flat tire?" Robert nodded. "I almost didn't stop. Had a tight schedule, was already running behind. For about 10 seconds, I debated just driving past." The admission hung in the air between them. "But you did stop," David pointed out. "Because of you, in a way," Robert said. "Not that I knew it then. But my mother raised me with stories about paying it forward, about how good deeds create chains that keep growing. After what you did for Thomas, I guess I felt, obligated isn't the right word. Inspired, maybe. David considered this. So you stopped because someone else had once helped you. And now look at us, Robert gestured between them. This whole unlikely friendship, all because of choices we made without knowing where they'd lead. The sliding door opened, and Thomas emerged with a pitcher of lemonade and 3 glasses balanced on a tray. Mom called. She's bringing Lisa and Rebecca for lunch. The baby too. As Thomas poured the drinks, Robert continued his train of thought. You know what the strangest part is? Even knowing how things turned out, the accident, the wheelchair, everything, I'd still stop for that flat tire. Every time. David raised his glass slightly. To stopping when it would be easier to keep driving. I'll drink to that, Robert smiled. After lunch, while the others chatted in the living room, David stepped outside again, needing a moment alone. The events of the past months swirled in his mind, the chance connection, the deepening bonds, the accident that had threatened to sever those new ties but had somehow strengthened them instead. His phone buzzed with a message from his commanding officer confirming his transfer to Fort Lewis. In 2 weeks, he would head to the other side of the country to start a new chapter. But unlike his previous postings, this time he wouldn't be leaving everything behind. Lisa joined him on the porch, watching the autumn leaves dance across the yard. Penny for your thoughts, she said. Just thinking about ripples, David replied. How one action leads to another, then another. Lisa nodded. When your father died, I worried so much about you being alone in the world once I was gone too. Now I look in there, she gestured toward the living room where laughter could be heard, and I see you've built yourself a family circle I never could have imagined. Inside, Robert was showing baby pictures on his phone to Rebecca, who held her now crawling daughter on her lap. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor, building a tower of blocks for the baby to knock down. The scene was ordinary in its domesticity, extraordinary in how it had come to be. You know, Lisa continued, when Robert first stopped to help me that day, I thought he was just being kind to an older woman with a flat tire. I never imagined he was actually completing a circle that began when you saved his son. David put his arm around his mother's shoulders. Maybe that's how it always works, we just usually don't get to see the full circle. As they rejoined the others, David looked at the faces that had become so important to him over these past months. From a random meeting on a rainy highway to this moment of shared laughter in a suburban living room, none of it planned, all of it meaningful. Later, as David prepared to leave, Robert wheeled himself to the door to see him off. 2 weeks until you head west, Robert said. I'll be back for Thanksgiving, David promised. And Christmas, if I can swing it. Robert nodded. We'll keep your place at the table. He hesitated, then added, you know, they say soldiers need something to fight for. But I think maybe what we all really need is something to come home to. David thought about the photograph that had started it all, a young soldier on a dashboard, connecting strangers in ways they could never have predicted. I'll see you soon, he said, and it wasn't just a pleasantry but a commitment. As David drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror at the house receding in the distance. Against all odds, he had found another place to call home, another family to claim as his own. Not by blood, but by something equally binding, the invisible threads of kindness, courage, and chance that weave lives together when we least expect it.